Let me show you a cool CSS pattern for creating layouts where elements extend outside their container. It's a very common thing in editorial design, but I often see engineers overcomplicate it. So today I want to show you a simple and elegant solution for it. See how the content area is narrow and centered. And that's good for readability because we want to keep the line length between 50 to 75 characters, but there's no reason for images to be this narrow. And that's a very common pattern. Here's a New York Times article, for example. We have a gallery here that takes the entire width of the screen. We have an image here that's also wider than the content. Why do I say engineers overcomplicate it? Let's take a look at the code. Here's how it's currently set up. The entire content sits inside an article with the class site main article, which has a max width defined using this variable with content. It sits in a different file, and it's centered horizontally using auto margins. And the parent site main here and site main here in the markup just sets the inline padding to make sure that on small screens the content doesn't touch the edges of the screen. It's a solid setup, and a lot of projects launch like this, but it gets tricky later when the project is already live, has a bunch of articles published, and you want to add wide components that extend beyond the content area later. In those cases, especially on large projects that have hundreds or thousands or sometimes even hundreds of thousands of articles, it's kind of scary to touch the styles that control the content area because you can break the entire thing if you're not careful. So what do we do instead? We create rules for those components that involve complex calculations with 100 viewport width units and negative margins that inevitably, in some edge cases, will lead to horizontal scrolling because, let's be honest, nobody gets those calculations right from the first try. So here's what I propose we do instead. Instead of starting with a container that has a max width and is centered, we make everything full width by default and apply max width and center only the components that need it. I know it's kind of hard to picture, so let me show you what I mean. First of all, let's remove the container rules altogether. I'm going to delete this file and delete the import. Now, if I open the website, everything should be full width. Perfect. And once these rules are removed, we can introduce a component that will control the widths of inner components. Another mouthful, I know, so bear with me. It will all make sense in just a few moments. Let me go back to the editor and create a new file here. I like to call that component entry content because it works with different types of contents. It could be a post, a page, a press release. All of those are entries, and it's very semantically correct. So we have the file. Let me just import it here and let me sort these guys to keep everything nice and tidy. Okay, so now that we have this file, let me resize this so we can see what's going on. Let's write the rules. So basically what I like to do is create a class like this and target every immediate child. But don't need margin bottom. We just want margin inline auto, and we want max inline size. And we'll use the variable that I defined in a separate file. I'll show you that variable in just a second. I have a file where I have defined the variable for content width, which I can reuse in different components if I need to. And I also created two more variables for content that's going to be slightly wider and for large content. So we have medium and large variables right here. Okay, so now that we have this declaration here, all we have to do to make it work is go and apply it in the markup. So I have the content flow component that we talked about in the previous video. I can put entry content on the same node, and once I do that, everything should look good again. Let me save it. Perfect. So we're back to the same layout visually, but the inner mechanics are different. Instead of having the content area that is centered, now we are targeting each individual element and applying max width to them, centering them horizontally. So why is this setup better? Because right now we can easily override the max width of any element inside entry content. I see that Copilot is super smart and already suggesting almost exactly what I want, but I don't want to call it align wide. I want to make it a little bit more semantic. So I'll call it is medium with, not just is medium with, I'll call it is medium with content. Perfect. That covers the medium width. And now we also need large width. Thanks again, Copilot. So now that we have these two utility classes, we can just apply them to any element inside the content area, and that will make them wider than the content area. So let's do just that. Okay, so one of the images is here. Let's copy let's use medium width for this one. And you can already see that it's taking the entire space of the screen because we have small screen on the right. So I'm just going to close it for now and apply the same class. Oh, actually, let me apply the large one here, is large with content. So if I go to the website here, you'll see that the first image is wider and the next one should be even more wide. And what about full width images, similar to how we saw the gallery on New York Times website? That's actually even more neat. If I go back to the entry content CSS file, what I can do is create another utility class for full width content. And instead of calling it is large, I'll call it full. And instead of actually setting any variable here, I'm just going to say none. And that will remove any restriction on the max width of the content. Let me copy this utility class. I'm going to apply it to this image. So after it's done, it should stretch to the entire width of the screen. So let me go find that image. It's right here. I'm going to paste it. And you can see that the image is actually full width. That's pretty cool, right? And you can keep reusing those utility classes for any element inside the content area to adjust their width. But there's still one thing that we need to take care of, and that is side gutters. So let me resize the screen to show you what I mean. On small screens, the content touches the edges of the viewport, and that's not nice. We should not build layouts that look like this. There are two ways we can go about it. First one is we can actually just add padding on the entry content class itself. So I'm going to set padding inline, and I have a variable for side gutters, so I'm just going to use that side gutter. Now if I open the website, you'll see that it's fixed. But there's one gotcha about this approach. We cannot use paddings and make elements full width like in a clean way, because since padding is set on the parent and we set max inline size to none on the full width element, it's no longer full width because we have paddings here. To fix this, we can either use negative margins, which I don't like to do that, or we can do something else. There's one more trick I want to show you in this video to tackle just that. Let's remove the padding first. Now, let's pretend for a second that desktop devices do not exist and we only need to style this for mobile. In that case, we actually don't need all these variables like with content medium, because the content area on mobile is already narrow and we can calculate it differently. We just need to take 100% of the width of the container and subtract the side gutter twice and just wrap it in a calc function 100% like that. And because the content is centered, we have this effect of gutters without actually using the padding on the parent container. Everything looks the same except for the wide and large components that we'll tackle in just a moment. So now let's remember again that we have the desktop. If I resize the screen, we'll see that this value is just too large. The logic is that we need this for mobile and we need our variables for desktop. Like obviously we can do media queries and whatever, but there's a very interesting observation about these two values. I will call this one a fluid value and this one, so I'll just put it here so we can compare them visually. So I'll call this one a fluid value and this one will be a fixed value. But there's a very interesting observation about these two. On any viewport, we need the smallest out of these two values. See for yourself. So this value is 40 rems, so that would be 640 pixels, and this one is fluid, so like it changes all the time. I'm gonna comment it out for now like that. So on large screen like this, what's the width? 1260, for example. The content area should be 640 as in the variable, but it's larger. So out of these two variables, we need the smallest one. And as we go smaller, when the screen becomes less than 640, we have the fluid value that's smaller than 640. So we can use that. Basically, we just need a function that would pick the min value out of these two. And luckily in CSS, we have a function like that. Instead of using media queries or container queries, we can make it more intrinsic and just use min, use this fluid value, and then ask the function to pick the minimum out of this fluid or fixed value. And if I save this, everything should work perfectly fine, except for the components with utility classes applied, but we'll tackle them in a few moments. So see, now it works again. We have our content area that is working perfectly fine on desktop and mobile, and we're not using paddings on the parent container. The last piece that we need to make this whole thing work is fix the utility classes. So obviously what we can do is we can just copy this declaration, update the value like this, and do the same here, but instead of medium, we'll just say large, and we can keep the last one at none because we don't need any max width on the full width element. But there is a cleaner way to do this. We actually can introduce a scoped variable here that we can call something like width max, because it only relates to the element that we're targeting. And here we can take this variable, the default width of the content, and make it a default. So now instead of width content in this calculation, we can just use width max. And instead of making the calculation for every single, we can just simply override this variable, and Copilot is smart enough to suggest exactly what I want. So, and now it looks much cleaner. You can continue introducing new utility classes like this, and it will all work perfectly fine. So if I preview the website, we now have paddings that work for wide images. We have paddings that work for large images, and our full width image doesn't have any padding. And that's it. Feel free to play with the demo. Let me know if you have any questions. I've used this approach in quite a few projects and never had any issues with it. Now, in this video, we've covered content width and horizontal rhythm. And if you're interested to learn how to create vertical rhythm and create consistent spacing between paragraphs and headings and other components in content area, I have a video just for that. These two patterns come in very handy on pretty much any project. So go and watch that video next, and I will see you in the next one.